Good morning. My name is Jacobson. I'm a librarian with the Ramsey County Libraries, and I coordinate the history and current events online programming for there. And today's program is brought to you through the co-sponsorship between Ramsey County Library, Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota, Global Minnesota, and the Foreign Policy Association. We're deeply grateful to all of these organizations for their support in bringing these talks to our communities. And our speaker today is Rick Olson. He's a retired professional with a variety of educational and life experiences. He's worked as an economist, an attorney, a certified financial planner, an agricultural loan officer, an agricultural cooperative president, a state representative in Michigan, and a public school business manager. He obtained a Juris Doctor degree from Stanford Law School and completed the coursework in 2 other Ph.D. programs, but declined to write thesis in either, so he is not a Ph.D. in those fields, which are agricultural economics and education administration. He's an avid traveler and has been to 44 countries and in all 50 of the United States. He's flown to the Nakivale Refuge Settlement in Uganda 3 times since February of 2020 to guide a nonprofit organization he founded to assist the refugees at Best Future School, and now in 4 such learning centers. He has also led the effort on 3 Rotary International Global Grants for refugee settlement camps in Uganda. He is now also involved in support of the efforts of Sustainable Cambodia. He currently resides in Prior Lake, Minnesota with his wife of 51 years. He's a retired school superintendent and the father of 2 boys, and this made me smile. Their ages 43 and 45. Rick is also an adventurer, having climbed Mount McKinley in Alaska in 1977. He rode his bicycle across the USA in 2016 and did a 19-day trek to the base camp of Mount Everest in 2017 and climbed Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania in 2019. He led Rotary International tours through Eastern Europe in 2019 and again in 2022. So we can say that Rick has been around the world a bit. And today he's going to be sharing about pandemic preparedness. So Rick, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Okay, thanks, Kay. First, I want to show thanks for your being here today. It makes me pleased to see that there are other people interested in these important topics, not only to our country, but for the world. And this topic particular for the world. So I will share my screen and we'll get rocking and rolling. Okay, the topic today is pandemic preparedness. And Global Minnesota has asked us to share these initial slides so you get a little bit more familiar with Global Minnesota. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization that has a whole bunch of programs. Its mission is to advance international understanding and engagement. It's been around for over 70 years, has 16 staff, and is supported by individual and corporate members. A whole lot of program areas, some free and some are low cost, and a number of other things. But bottom line is for today is our great decisions discussion groups. So there's a lot of activities covering a lot of countries, involving a lot of people. Now these great decision discussions is really a cooperation between Global Minnesota and the Foreign Policy Association. As each year, the Foreign Policy Association puts out the Great Decisions book, which has 10 selected topics, and then Global Minnesota is responsible for disseminating that within Minnesota and similar organizations in other states. There are over 24 grassroots organizations or other groups like yours that, and probably 20 or more of us presenters. But the most important part of this slide is the one that's in red there. The views expressed by me today is going to be my opinions, my information and so forth, and is not the opinions necessarily of Foreign Policy Association or Global Minnesota. So take that with a word of salt, or dash of salt, whatever the expression is. Okay, if you want to learn more about Global Minnesota, go to globalminnesota.org and you can become a member, or you can sign up for newsletters and so forth. It's a very good organization that I've enjoyed being associated with. Okay, on to the topic for today. We'll talk about definitions, COVID pandemic impacts, the global health system overview, basically about the World Health Organization, then a little bit of evaluation of efforts by WHO and in Minnesota, some recommendations, and a final warning from Michael Osterholm, who's here from Minnesota. We'll start out with definitions so people know what we're talking about. The difference between an epidemic and a pandemic. And an epidemic is just simply the widespread occurrence of an infectious disease within a community, whereas a pandemic is a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease over a whole country or a world at a particular time. And a term that you'll hear often when you're talking about pandemics is the word zoonotic, because that's an infectious disease that has jumped from a non-human animal to humans, such as from a bat to humans. And these zoonotic pathogens can be many different kinds, bacterial, viral, or parasitic. But 75% of the newly emerging diseases currently affecting humans originate in animals. And some of the diseases of most concern in the United States that are zoonotic influenza, so forth. Rabies, brucellosis, Lyme disease. So we'll plunge ahead. Viruses are just really small, fancy words, obligate intracellular parasites. Have a little bit of DNA or RNA. The important thing about them is that they can mutate very quickly, but they vary greatly in terms of virulence, in terms of how serious they are in causing death, and also how quickly they can be transmitted. There are just thousands of different kinds of species of viruses, over 11,273 named virus species. So we're talking about a really great deal of variation among them. Now, there have been many pandemics over the years, and we'll look first at COVID, which currently has over 7 million reported deaths throughout the world. But experts say that there may be as many as 24 million because not all deaths are reported. And they look at excess deaths, they look at how many deaths were expected during that period of time based normally on normal circumstances, and then how many actually died. And there is a suspicion that those extra ones have been caused by COVID. And when you compare that against past epidemics or pandemics, COVID is a big deal. Even 7 million, it really ranks up high. You go back to plague in 165 AD, that was 5 million. So, we're over that. Go up Asian flu or the flu pandemic back in 1918, that was a biggie. 20 to 50 million around the world, and the AIDS, 36 million. So, those are some big deals, and COVID, is a big deal by itself. Now, pandemics can occur or start in all different locations. You kind of get some idea on this. They're from all over where they've come from. But the areas that are of most concern right now are the areas in China, in Africa, and in South America, and they all happen to be in areas that can be warm and humid. So some people say, how do you come up with a name like COVID-19? Well, it's a little bit along the lines of SARS, which is somewhat similar to COVID, but their two viruses are quite different. But the 19 actually refers to the year 2019 when COVID emerged. Some people ask, well, particularly the people who are going to get into conspiracies, says, well, we're just hearing about COVID-19. Why haven't we heard about the first 18? Well, there weren't any first 18 because 19 refers to the year. So So COVID is an upper respiratory infection, but actually it dates back 10,000 years ago. And it's very similar to 30% of all common colds. And the strains that emerged over time, they vary in danger and complexity. So this is something that's been around a long time. It's just that this variation has come out and caused the problems. Now, y'all remember back in February of 2020, when it first became news, I had just returned home from Uganda when a lot of the news broke out. So if I had stayed in Uganda just a few more days, I might have had to stay there for a while. But anyway, it rose quickly, then it waned a little bit, and it had lots of peaks and valleys over time. And finally, in 22, people said the pandemic is over as a pandemic. It's still with us. So it varied. Now, like I said before, it's killed over 7 million people. And the left side of this graph shows the red is the Americas. And interesting that our share of deaths is really larger than any other area. So Western Hemisphere has contributed greatly to the deaths number. And the United States is way up there as well. As of May 2nd of 23, which is about a year and a half ago now, when it was 1.161 million, noteworthy is that that's more than twice the number of Americans killed in World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined. And a question that sometimes arises is, if it kills this many people and there's potential for other pandemics to happen in the future, why don't we pay more attention to pandemic preparedness when it could be killing more than a potential war might? So good question, but this was not a real enviable record we're seeing on this page. But we got to remember that COVID-19 also caused other losses. Worldwide, they're estimating that it was $28 trillion losses worldwide. Noteworthy, parents with school children particularly, school children's educational losses estimated as 1 year of school. We are aware that many people suffered some mental health issues during COVID. There's been a significant drop in childhood vaccination rates, which makes other diseases more dangerous and possible to spread. Really, we'll talk more about this, but a great deal of loss of social cohesion. And there is really a great deal of politicizing this whole deal, individual liberties versus community responsibilities. There are always trade-offs in decisions that are made in pandemics, and those really came to light during the COVID period. You look at the most vaccinated states versus the least vaccinated states, and we'll show some more information about that later. And greatly, there's a loss of trust in government and institutions, and public health, including Dr. Fauci, was demonized, which was really unfortunate. Another unfortunate thing is that diseases are not equitable. They don't treat everybody equally, and how we respond to them does not treat everybody equally. When you look at the world vaccination rates, you can see that the higher income countries have a much higher vaccination rate than others. And the lower income have a great deal of problems getting vaccinations. Early in 2020, there was announced that Johnson & Johnson was going to be having a COVID vaccine clinical trial, and they were asking for volunteers. And I volunteered because their vaccine was going to be one that did not have to have really cold storage for it to continue to be effective, where the others did. And I knew that in Naka Valley Refugee Settlement and other places in Africa, they needed that more viable vaccine for a longer period of time. Ultimately, they got it, and so, but disease, like everything else in the world, is not fair. Now, there have been some successes in this COVID period. The biggest success was probably the development of vaccines versus the technology called mRNA. That was the government, U.S. government operation funded by what was called Operation Warp Speed. And then initially there was some hoarding of vaccines by various countries, including the United States. But then there was a group agreement called COVAX that was developed. So there was a global pooled vaccine purchasing platform, so other countries could more easily get the vaccine. So that was something we've learned to do and could be deployed again in the future if needed. But we've also learned how to do social distancing, case isolation, close contact tracking management, how to close epidemic areas, and really traffic controls. And we've learned what works and what doesn't work, as well as masks. And we also have done, you can look at this as an experiment in online learning and virtual workspaces and telework. So a great deal of expansion in telework and online learning, and some of that it will be a positive that carries forward. It's into today and into the future. So, but obviously it caused some issues during the process. Now we're going to look at a little bit about the worldwide health management. It's primary responsibility of the World Health Organization. The experts in this field regard the 2003 SARS pandemic as really a coming out moment, because the Director General of WHO, instead of as usual relying on official data coming from the country, they used unofficial data and called out China for stonewalling WHO. Finally, worldwide opinion influenced China, but all this then really triggered the worldwide discussion of how pandemics should be handled, and the International Health Regulations of 2005 was generated, which gave some new authority to WHO, but it also retained some of the old limitations. But what they did was they created what was called the Public Health Emergency of International Concern Declaration of Responsibility based on the World Health Organization. So when there's really an extraordinary event, health risk of international spread of disease that carries implications for public health beyond the affected states' national borders, who is responsible for making a formal declaration? Okay, that's basically a notice to the world to look out. Since 2005, there have been 8 public health emergency indications. Anyway, in 2009, the swine flu, then there's an ongoing polio declaration, which I've been involved in polio eradication through Rotary International, which I'm a member of. And Rotary International has been involved in this for years, and down to, I think, back to 2 countries now. There was some outbreaks most recently. So we're getting close, but we just got to get over the finish line on that. The Gates Foundation has also been big funding that effort. But there was the Ebola outbreak, Zika virus, another kind of Ebola, then the COVID, and even this year, the Mpox outbreak. So WHO has been busy in following up on these and seeing whether a pandemic should be declared. Now, the World Health Organization has a huge mandate. is to promote the attainment of all peoples of the highest possible level of health. Well, that's all health issues everywhere, to be all things to all people. That's quite a mandate. But it has really four roles: serve as a global hub for science and technical expertise, and to set goals and agendas for health, and then be a chief convener and coordinating authority in global health. And so basically all the information goes into WHO and back out and so forth, the sharing of that information, which is really, really critical. And it also serves as a political venue for member states to advance their interests. I believe there's something like 194 members of this, so it's a big deal. But one of the underlying principles is to avoid unnecessary interference with international traffic and trade. You want to control disease, but you don't want to interfere with the economy of the world unnecessarily either. So how they work is they must first seek to verify reports of outbreaks from the official government and try to collaborate with them to control the outbreak. Only if that government refuses may WHO rely on unofficial data. But the problem here is WHO has no enforcement authority. Okay, and this can be really shown through this timeline, because in December 31, China reported a cluster of cases of pneumonia. Okay, jump ahead to January 12, China shared the genetic sequence of COVID-19. Now you may say 12 days from saying, hey, we got some diseases, and then we're able to release the COVID sequence. You doubt that they just began to look at this as a serious problem, on December 31st. They knew something was going on long before, it looks like to me. On January 2nd and 23rd, WHO held a meeting, but they could not reach a consensus that a public health emergency of international concern had happened yet. They didn't have enough evidence from China. We met again on January 30th, and then they did declare the public health emergency of international concern. And then move on to March 11th, they finally said that that COVID could be characterized as a pandemic. So there's quite a bit of delay here that was a great deal of concern to most everybody involved in this field. Because our concerns here in the United States was that WHO moved too slowly on COVID-19. And basically because of problems, foot dragging by China. And part of that was WHO was protecting China from criticism. It ended up being inconsistent guidelines being issued. And the conclusion was that we really need greater accountability, not only from WHO, but individual countries who may not want to look bad. So what has WHO done well? And what could have done differently? Well, you might say that WHO responded reasonably quickly with a public health emergency of international concern declaration on January 30th, despite China's lack of cooperation. And WHO knew it was being misled, but they tried diplomacy without authority to require China to do anything. In other words, were they being friendly to China to try to, because if they got really harsh on them, China would withhold information even worse. At the top, you can always second guess, after the fact. They should have been more firm. They should have been more diplomatic. It's easy to make Monday morning quarterback calls. But one of the big problems with WHO is that they really do not have a very big budget. In the 2021 budget, when they were really concerned about this, 2.4 billion. And that's the size budget of a large US hospital. And a quarter of the budget of the US Center of Disease Control. So really, they don't really have a whole lot of money. They rely on member states' mandatory contributions, but they come late. 80% of its budget is voluntary contributions, like from the Gates Foundation. So it's not really financially sound. So it's got a very small budget in relation to its mandate, and it's uncertain when they're going to get it. It's unstable. The biggest problem is no enforcement authority. Like the conductor in an orchestra, the waving the wand, constructor may wave the wand, but that doesn't help the music come. The musicians have to produce the music. Similarly, who can make a declaration, but if countries don't respond, not much they can do. Because when a public health emergency of international concern is declared, the affected states still have the opportunity to present its case against that declaration. And so as a result, WHO is very deferential to member state sovereignty. Bottom line, WHO has a huge mandate, it's not well funded, little if any enforcement authority. So really we can't blame WHO for not doing what it's not empowered to do. Someone has said member states get what they pay for and they get what they order, but they do not magically get what they need. So it's an effort, but not perfect. One of the questions is, when is the pandemic over? Well, it's really a political decision when officials believe that the losses from containing the disease are greater than the losses from the disease. In other words, those mental health issues, the students learning less, the closing of businesses, so there's economic losses that way. So, you know, there's really got to be a balance struck between those. And so it's ultimately a political decision, you know, that declaration, although an official simply saying that the pandemic's over doesn't really solve the problem. One of the conclusions is we may be done with COVID, but COVID is not done with us. It's still there. Another question that comes up is, what countries did the best to contain COVID? Now, there was a 2019 report that rated countries on a global health security index, and it ranked the United States as the best country in the world for all aspects of pandemic preparedness, including rapid response to and mitigation. Now, look at the chart that was made. There's US right there at the top, you know, looking good. In other countries, not so good. You know, big ones like China, India, they weren't that prepared for a pandemic. Yet, after 3 years of COVID, the US has suffered far more deaths per capita than any similarly wealthy country. We're the best prepared, but we've done worst. Now, when COVID started, you know, we pretty much tracked what the European Union did, pretty close to the same. So that we weren't you know, worse than them at that point. Our excess deaths were comparable to European countries. I think some other countries did far better. Australia, New Zealand, and Asia did a lot of testing and contact tracing. In spring of 2020, South Korea was testing at a rate 100 times higher than the US. So there's other countries that did better than us, even though early on we didn't do too badly compared to them. However, it was in the months after the vaccines were made available to the public, you know, June 21 through March 22nd, that our death count started to shoot above those of the Europeans. We suffered 3 times as many excess deaths as the United Kingdom, more than 4 times as many per capita as Sweden, and 20 times as many as New Zealand. Not good. And you can see we were going along pretty much along with the European Union for a while, and then the European Union dropped, and we just kept on dying. Not so good. Now, one of the problems was we had a lower vaccine uptake than the other countries. But other countries also did a better job of getting the vaccine to the most vulnerable people, which was proven to be the elderly and the people who have some underlying medical conditions. Here in the United States, vaccine was free, but also many unvaccinated people died because they didn't trust the public health system. And we look at this very clearly when you start comparing states. Here is the average vaccination rate and vaccination rates on the bottom of here, and the scale excess mortality is on here on the vertical axis. So here was the average states. Here are the states that were least vaccinated, much far higher mortality, and here are the states with much higher vaccination rate and much lower mortality. And also the UK and Sweden are shown here. And New Zealand, look way down here. The high vaccination rate, hardly any excess deaths. Whether people in the states got vaccinated or not made a difference. And what could be a partial cause of that variance is a willingness to be vaccinated by political party. The blue is the Democrat Party, and in the surveys, and a lot of them got vaccinated, then it dropped off, and then got picked up again. Among the Republicans, it was fairly low, bumped up a little bit, and then came back down again. And this willingness to be vaccinated then shows up in those early results by states. Unfortunately, this became highly politicized, and that was unfortunate because that caused a lot of deaths. As a result, Norway, Sweden, Denmark lost little or no life expectancy, where US, here we lost nearly 3 years. And among Native Americans, it was really bad. Their normal life expectancy had been like 72, and it dropped to 65. They were really badly hit. Now, on the plus side, the US economy has responded well after the pandemic, better than most other wealthy countries. A lot of money was allocated by Congress to fight this or get the economy going again, over 4.65 trillion of federal funds. So that helped the economy get going again. However, one of the downsides of that is we have experienced inflation as a combination of snarled supply chains, pent-up demand, and fattened wallets happen at the same time. Now, I know most of us, or maybe all of us, received those checks from the federal government. And some of us really didn't need it. And some of us really had, when we're not traveling as much and so forth, we had very little opportunity to spend it. So once we could, boy, the money started getting spent. And when you get excess demand, more than supply, prices go up. We also knew that supply chains really got messed up. Ships couldn't be loaded, ships couldn't be unloaded. Getting stuff distributed was a problem. So inflation has been a result of COVID. But when you compare how the US responded economically by the federal government, some other countries have been far less vigorous. But their recovery has not been as robust as us. But when people blame the federal government's action for inflation, that may or may not be good. That idea may not hold because these other countries have also faced the same inflationary pressure. So it's easy to place blame. It's hard to say that that was actually true or not. let's look at how Minnesota has done in combating COVID. And this is really a personal opinion of mine. We experienced business closures, school closures, mask mandates, mask recommendations, vaccinations required for admission to Timberwolves games. During that time, I was just, for something to do, I was doing some security work. And I remember games to get into a Timberwolves game. People had to show that they had been vaccinated. Obviously, before you went on flights, you needed those COVID tests. So anyway, were all these mandates and stuff good or bad decisions? Well, it's hard to say. It's when you make a decision in a crisis, it's very difficult to predict the success or failure of a decision, or whether other alternatives would be better. Was it Yogi Berra said that projections are very difficult, particularly about the future. One of his oxymorons. Anyway, it's easy to criticize a decision for if you had only, because that's what's called a counterfactual. You can't ever prove that if you'd done something different, you would have had different results. But as Kamala Harris likes to call it, Walls, the coach Walls would say, it's much easier to make a good call on Monday morning than during a Sunday game. And my assessment is that Governor Walls, he relied heavily on one of our nation's foremost experts in infectious disease, Michael Osterholm. And he's a Regent Professor and Director of Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the U of M. And I can't fault anybody who follows the best advice that they can get. Throughout my life, I found that it's better to follow someone who knows something about something than try to make it up myself. Okay, how can we prevent pandemics? The fellow who does the Great Decisions Masterclass said we need to look back at what we did or did not do well in COVID. But ultimately, countries need to decide whether to cooperate or not. And we do have some options. But basically, getting ready for a pandemic is very similar to the ants and the grasshopper, where the ants work and work and work and store things for future, where the grasshopper is dancing in the sun. Bottom line is we could learn to stock up, prepare, and keep watch as a global community better. There is a consensus that the strategies to combat a pandemic include transparent communications. That's what China did not, and that is a problem. Now, an equal problem is how we react to that transparent communications, because South Africa did alert the world that they had noticed Omicron variant had come out, and South Africa then faced repercussions because of that. It didn't start in South Africa. They were simply the first who reported it. So you got to, transparent communications is good, but we got to be careful how we react to that. We need to respond based on evidence-based research and not on some conspiracy theory or some idea that, well, want to get involved too much in politics here, but you know what I'm talking about. There was some advice given that wasn't so good. We need to have a plan of action and what to do, and they really say we need a lot of free shots and tests. We need to be ready to roll those out as quickly as possible and slow it down as quickly as possible. Now, one other solution worldwide is just to vaccinate the whole world. When we first look at the share of population receiving at least one dose of the COVID vaccine, these brown areas here have very, very low vaccinations, and the very dark have at least one dose. So we're lower. But the idea is we need to be cautious about thinking that we can stop a virus at its origin. Because let's say something happens in Africa. We can say we're not going to allow any flights from Africa. We can stop importing stuff from Africa. The problem is with the way we travel today, people travel in all directions from every country, and it could go from one country to another and then to the United States. So, that's why they say we need to, when something happens, we need to immediately start vaccinating the whole world. The virus does not discriminate in terms of who it wants to vaccinate, who it wants to infect. So one of the problems is that, according to this survey, there's of who say the country is now more divided than before the coronavirus outbreak. 4/5, so 81% of the countries say our country is more divided. And then you say what country is failing to effectively handle the coronavirus outbreak? 66, or 2/3 of the country say we're not addressing it. And this is worse than in other countries, which is sad to say. It really shows the polarization within the country. Public trust in the U.S. government has plummeted. You can see from back in the Eisenhower time, pretty high trust, and it's dropped and it peaked again, in response to 9/11. Then it dropped again, 19% in Obama years, and in 2023, 16% had trust in the U.S. government. 1 in 7. God, that's not very good. And that affects how people would react to a future pandemic announcement and so forth. So some recommendations for how to prevent pandemics, and some more here, is to improve global coordination and leadership at the highest levels. In other words, avoid politicizing vaccines, testing, masks, and treatments. And research shows that people respond best to messages that are clear, consistent, honest, and well-reasoned. In our reaction with COVID, we had various inconsistent things coming out. Now, part of the problem is that people were saying what they saw from the most recent studies. And then sometimes another study comes out that says, oh, that earlier study was not good. As the one for masks, the first one for masks came out was not a good study. And so when someone like Dr. Fauci comes out and contradicts what he previously said, people distrust, a lot of people distrusted him because of that. Really, he was responding to the more recent, better research. There needs to be strengthened global governance and accountability for pandemic preparedness. And obviously, the big problem there is the sovereignty of the countries. Bottom line is countries ultimately act in what they believe is in their best self-interest. Previous agreements be damned. That's a tough one. So we should provide a more sound financial footing for pandemic preparedness and response. As I've showed you before, that current funding was small, uncertain, and unstable. So the U.S. government did establish a fund for that, but the funding has actually fallen short. We could invest in gaps in the infrastructure to monitor and respond to threats. We could ensure that every country has the capacity to stop outbreaks at their source. That's the best. Stop it from spreading to begin with. Then provide timely, equitable access to life-saving medical countermeasures and tools. Like I said, vaccines are not equally available. Tests and treatments either. We could do some more surveillance, manufacturing, and coordinated research and development. For example, they're working on a universal vaccine that may cover a wide variety of viruses rather than having to have a single one for COVID-19. or one of its variants. And so, and that same thing is looking at can we vary our supply chain instead of having one source for masks, which China was the big source for masks. Can we have various countries also producing them? So if they become unavailable one place, we can get them elsewhere. Or could we, have stockpiles of some of these things in our country, even when they're not needed? So that when they are needed, we've got them. Possibility. Unfortunately, attention to pandemics and preventing them has fallen severely. Some call it amnesia or COVID fatigue, as we've shifted our concerns to other areas. We're just not paying that much attention anymore. We got plenty of other problems to worry about. And funding for pandemic prevention has shriveled, partly caused by government gridlock because of continuing resolutions. So we've not really done anything more to prepare for coming pandemic threats. And Bill Gates is one in particular who keeps saying they are coming. They are coming. We just don't know when and from where. Of the WHO's 10 highest priority diseases, 6 of them still have no diagnostic tests. We do for COVID-19, but 6 of the others we don't. So if they, really start coming out more, we're hurt. We're coming from behind, starting from behind. Another problem is that it's actually been proven that current vaccines for flu and COVID are only effective for only a percentage of people, and they don't last real long. For example, some say that some of these vaccines are only effective for 20 to 30% of the people who get them, and they may only last for 6 months or so, and then you need a booster. Also, we don't have the infrastructure to manufacture vaccines quickly enough. So even if pharmaceutical company has done the research and a vaccine is created, whether we can get enough quickly enough depends on the availability of a number of things: fertilized chicken eggs, reagents, adjuvants, vials and syringes. How about the workforce protection needed for the people who are making these vaccines? Again, the problem with needing ultra cold storage for some of the vaccines, many of the less developed countries simply don't have that. Obviously, shipping may be a problem with pandemic supply chain problems, and then simply administration of the shots may be a challenge in many low and middle income countries. So lots of issues. We're coming toward the end here. How should we reform WHO? Well, number one, they say there is a consensus rule that there needs to be consensus before the public announcement of the pandemic can be done. And it needs to be by unanimous rule of that committee. So that's an issue if the countries begin to hold out. How those assessments are done, it needs to be evaluated and revised. The regional offices are not that powerful in some ways, but they also can stonewall information getting to the central office for WHO. The recommendation is there need to be some independent advisors to the Director General that aren't, that they're not tied to any particular country. And lastly, they say that the kind of investigatory teams that were involved in, checking to see that whether Iran was having nuclear weapons or not, in preparation for that, need that kind of investigative team that's independent of any individual countries that can just go in and check things out. Of course, with the sovereignty issue, that may not be so easy. Okay, our expert here in Minnesota he did this article for Foreign Affairs saying the world is not ready for the next pandemic. He says, if officials should make no mistake, there will be more influenza and coronavirus pandemics, and any one of them can prove to be far more catastrophic than the COVID-19 pandemic. Governments cannot wait to prepare until a virus is already spreading around the world. It is time for all nations to wake up to the danger and prepare for a new pandemic. So it's lots of things the governments could do, whether it involves vaccines, drug treatments, diagnostic tests, designing systems for manufacturing personal protective equipment, invest heavily in vaccine research and development, so forth and so on. Lots of things we need to and should be doing. And as I said, we asked the question before, why aren't we spending as much money or more money on preventing these pandemics when they could kill more people than wars could, and we're spending as much money as we are on military defense. Bottom line, with regard to preparation for coming pandemics, when all is said and done, more will have been said than done. So with that, I'll open up for questions from the audience. In the articles, in the Great Decision, they did post some questions that you might be thinking about or want answers to. Does the United States have an interest and responsibility in helping other countries secure access to life-saving vaccines, medicines, and medical supplies in the event of a global pandemic? What's our responsibility, bottom line? Why? And if not, why are we not? What does the cycle of panic and neglect mean when it comes to pandemics? And why does it keep happening? Okay, and this is the question I've said a couple times. Why hasn't the COVID pandemic triggered the same kind of robust foreign policy responses as other deadly crises like World War II and 9/11? And so forth. So with that, I'll stop sharing and we'll see if we have questions from the audience.
So the first question that we have is, did the African nations that had low vaccination levels also have low COVID levels? And if so, why?
I can only speak on that about that in my work with the Nakivale refugee settlement in Uganda. They had low vaccination rates, but they didn't really suffer all that badly from COVID. And part of the reason is much of the country, the people live out in the open, lots of outside living. And so you really don't transmit as much outside when people are spread out as you would in buildings. But they did have a lot of roadblocks and stuff that on the roads entering the country and such. So they did work on that. But I think it's primarily attributable to we are more dense. China is more dense in population than the African nations.
Okay. A question that I have is, I know that back in 2020, in April of 2020, Trump proposed withholding funding from WHO to take a look at what they were actually doing, and then things didn't get really fully restored in terms of the US contributions to WHO until, was it in Biden's administration, or did funding start to come back before then?
I don't know the exact timing, but what the question really raises is the dangers of politicizing a disease, whether it be posing suggested solutions for medications you should take, or really penalizing WHO for not being able to do what they really didn't have the authority to do. They didn't have the enforcement authority. and the people who were there did the best they thought they could do. And unfortunately, they couldn't force China to give information sooner. And I don't know. I don't know that there ever has been a thorough evaluation of the origin of COVID-19. The consensus is that it's most likely came from the wet markets in China, from the animals. But there's still conspiracy theorists who think it came from a lab. So we don't really know.
Right. Is funding directly related to lowering death tolls, both amount and speed of raising funds?
Well, funding drives a lot of things, whether it be creating the vaccines or creating the supply lines to get vaccines to the right people. Whether you have funding ahead of time so you stockpile masks or all these things. So money is needed for most everything. So that's a critical issue. And well, funding for who? Obviously, they need to have adequate staff to follow up on all the leads, potential problems that they get, because I'm sure information is constantly flowing to them about possibilities, and they need to see is it real or not. So ultimately, money greases at almost everything.
So there's a vast difference in vaccine uptake rates in countries such as Sweden and New Zealand. It's really striking. And how have these countries approached their populations differently than the US did? I mean, to be able to achieve such great results, you would say.
I don't have real good information to answer that question, but it was noteworthy that Sweden early on did take the approach that we're just going to let COVID run wild here in our country, build up the amount of people infected to the point that it just kind of kills itself off, that won't transmit anymore. And that worked for a while, and then it didn't. So different countries certainly did approach COVID in different ways. Ultimately, I think all experts say that vaccinations, widespread vaccination, is by far the best way. The contact tracing early on can be very, very effective. But sooner or later, when COVID got widespread, there were just too many sources and too many people infected to effectively do that. Early on, contact tracing could be really helpful, when it's few and far between. But
yeah, I mean, I would assume that with New Zealand being more isolated, definitely is a factor versus.
Yeah, I would say that is so. And Sweden, I think there's probably a whole lot greater trust in the government and institutions than here in the United States as well.
So, okay. No, okay. Is WHO concerned about Trump pulling the US out of the organization again? Could it survive if I mean, because of his previous record in 2020, could it survive if the US did pull out?
Is it concerned? I'm sure it's concerned.
Mm-hmm.
Could it survive? Well, I would say probably, but maybe crippled. When you remember when we talked about 80% of its funding came from nonprofit organizations and so forth, so, and other countries do, maybe pay late, but, many do pay. But would other countries stop paying with the US stop? That's always a danger. I would say it would continue, but maybe in a crippled form.
Okay. Question about, I'm taking it that this is about COVID. Is there a consensus now about testing and when it should be done, and when people are no longer infectious. Or I'm going to throw in there, if it continues to mutate, can there ever be a consensus? Um,
I don't know that testing is very widespread at this point. So I don't know how to answer that for
mhm,
testing for the disease itself. Um, I I would think, however, that in countries or places where there begins to be a rise in what officials suspect might be COVID again, they would be wanting more and more testing just to check that out and see if there's additional factors we need to, additional things we need to do. Yes, this virus will continue to mutate and new viruses will come out.
right.
So we do need to have the capability of testing for one disease or another um, to know whether we've got a problem that we need to really get going on creating a vaccine for that. You know, just like the Omicron vaccine when that, you know, when that virus came out, you know, pharmaceuticals scrambled and figured, okay, we got to get a new variant vaccine for this.
Yeah, I would think that a consensus would be new with each variant that they they find, because they're like going, oh, this new variant's out, but then they're like going, but it's mutating to another. It's really hard to have a consensus when things keep
Yeah.
changing. So, okay, while we wait for a question, do you want to answer one of the ones that you brought up before?
um, See if I remember what the questions were. Um, well, why don't we treat this as the same as a war or a military war? That's a this is total speculation on my part,
Hmm.
but um, if virus is a silent killer as compared to a bullet or a bomb, and so those are more dramatic. And when behavioral psychologists have really studied this, and people react more to a dramatic event than they do something that's kind of creeps up and quiet. So just maybe it's just a natural human reaction of how we react to, you know, let's say an airplane goes down, people get far more scared about about flying than they do about the tens of thousands of people who are killed on the highways every day or every year.
Mhm.
So I think that may be a big problem, our big explanation. Does the U.S. have a responsibility? Well, I think, well, again, this is a personal opinion. Do we have responsibility to other people in other countries? I would say from a humanitarian position, yes, we do. But when you look at the responsibility of the U.S. to the U.S. citizens, we're we're not an island on ourselves. We're so connected now that, you know, for the federal government to take care of United States citizens, we need to be concerned about what's happening in other countries.
Mhm.
So yes, there is a responsibility. Why don't we take more? Why doesn't the federal government take that more seriously? Politics. Um, who cares about those other countries? Well, you know, we're looking at America first, without thinking how much connected we are.
So one question here, asking about the efficacy of wastewater testing and how widespread that is.
I don't know how widespread it is, but it's proven to be pretty sophisticated and a good test. Um, so you know, that certainly would be a better when people suspect there's a problem, might be a better way of than running out and trying to do individual people getting tested. If you can do a test of the wastewater that there is a spread of disease in that particular area, man, that's been pretty impressive to me.
So, has COVID helped pave the way for better pandemic response in the future?
Well, I think the general consensus is that we've not learned a whole lot. uh, when you start looking at funding, people not wanting pretty much even to talk about it, um, you know, I think one of the reasons people don't want to say too much about it is because it raises this whole question of the polarization within the country.
Mhm.
You know, during COVID, I remember an individual I know was going to the COVID parties at that bar in Lakeville that was open against regulations. They were there to try to spread COVID, and which was nuts to me. But so you know, people don't want to talk about things that may cause tensions now. Just like communications, even within a family about politics, is oftentimes avoided.
Yeah, well, in some ways there's steps forward and I think of steps back in terms of when you see diseases that are making a comeback because people aren't vaccinating against them anymore and choosing not to vaccinate when it's like seems to be a proven track record for why to have a vaccinations.
Yeah,
But
that's obviously a concern for school children not being vaccinated. That's putting other people's kids
at risk.
in danger. And at what point do we have social responsibility for each other? And so
Mm.
basically, you're saying if I'm not going to get my kids vaccinated, you're basically saying I don't care about other people, which is, in my view, it's again personal opinion. It's not a good attitude.
Yeah. Okay, question. The total number of deaths from COVID was higher than other wealthy countries. Were there significant differences in the patient characteristics between the countries? And I
What was
think,
that? What was that last part? Was the difference in what?
were there significant differences in the patient characteristics between
Oh,
the countries?
patient's characteristics. Again, I don't have that information, but let me guess. Um, some countries have a much younger average age than United States, Japan, China, so forth. Like in Africa, average age is very young. And the death rate in younger people is much lower than in older people, and in people who have other underlying conditions. When you look at a lot of underlying conditions are correlated with obesity, and you go to other countries, and because they don't have cars, or they use public transportation more and walk more, you see far fewer people who are obese. Again, that should, I would expect that would also then affect the death rate. Again, just guessing, trying to use a
So,
little bit of logic.
yeah, I would also think, well, we see a correlation you showed between the states of
Yeah,
which of our states were more vaccinated versus which ones weren't.
yeah.
And then definitely a correlation then in terms of deaths.
Yeah.
So, um, yeah, okay, I'm gonna put something over in chat because I don't know if everyone can get to it in Q&A. Somebody shared a U of M dashboard showing wastewater data regarding COVID. So let me get over into chat here, and you can always click on that then. This is to everyone. Post. Okay, I want to do it for type a message here. Okay. I know the fun of us doing this to everyone and host panelists. Huh, Paul, I don't know if there's a way for me to,
Well, you're trying to figure that out. Let me make a comment. When I do these presentations, not only for pandemic preparedness, but when I do the climate change ones, the global migration ones, um, I end up feeling, boy, I am a real downer. Um, I have a great deal of trouble being really optimistic about some of these issues because we're having so great difficulty in addressing them. So I'm sorry if I sound pessimistic today, but I'm trying to follow the facts and kind of I develop my opinions based on those facts and other experts that I hear from. And there are some things that it's hard to be optimistic about. There are a number of ways that we are not leaving this world for our kids and grandkids in the way that I would really feel good about. And maybe you feel the same. So
Hey,
sorry for being a downer today, but um, you know,
okay,
in terms of in chat,
yeah.
there's a blue section that should say like hosts and panelists. If you drop down, go to everyone, click on that, and then you can click a message that will go to everyone, including the attendee.
But I don't have that as everyone is not one of my options in that.
Here, try now.
Okay, thank you. And enter. Okay, so that's over in chat now, if people wanna
yep,
click on that and
visible.
so that's there for you to click on. But if you have any questions about anything, put those in Q&A. Okay, also, individuals with symptoms of long COVID would seem to provide an argument for keeping up with vaccinations. Like those who seem to have that long.
I would say probably yes. Just about a week and a half ago, I got my most recent booster.
Yes, I need to go in for one soon. Let me get back to another question from the book because I have the
Okay.
book. Um, okay. What do you think is the most important investment we can make to help stop infectious disease outbreaks from becoming deadly pandemics? Do you have an
Hmm.
idea of what might be one of the best investments? I know it's something to think on.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Obviously, having a ready fund to throw at vaccine preparation is probably got to be one of the high points though. You don't want to have to wait a long time to get that vaccine. I think early on, as I said, contact tracing can be very useful. And if we had public acceptance of that, that would be good. So early on, when there's a few enough number of those things to trace, you might be able to stop things, or slow things down a lot. So, but other than that, to the extent that masks can help for airborne diseases like this, having them available, stockpiled somehow, could be good. It was interesting. Let's see, when was it? I went to Japan, 22. Even when here in the United States, we didn't consider masks to be at all, or COVID at all to be much of an issue any longer. Everybody walking outside in the downtown Tokyo, they were still wearing masks. So just by their culture, they were far more willing to do that than we have been. So
Okay. And here somebody's commenting possible answer to what might be the best investment would be maybe invest in public health agencies at the state level beyond. And I say fight for our public health agencies at the national
Oh,
level too.
yeah, one of the things that I've heard is one of the reasons that pandemics can get going is we do not spend enough time and money and effort on our public health systems. And because if people have fewer of those underlying health conditions, they would be less likely to die. And so, there is a connection there. And when you get down to public health, my wife and I have been listening to some real experts on nutrition and health and the connection between the foods we eat and the diseases we have. As a nation, when we eat a lot of sugar, particularly added sugar to most of what we eat, and we eat a whole lot of ultra refined, ultra processed fiber, that's not really good for us either. So there are things that we can do individually to treat ourselves better to make us less susceptible to disease.
Okay, so question here then on why do we seem to be focusing on pandemics as only being caused by viruses? Aren't there other organisms that can cause a pandemic? And
probably very good question. I'd say probably the focus right now on viruses is because of our recent experience with a virus. That statistic I cited earlier, that 75% of the pandemic viruses and folks are expected to be coming from animals. So, but one of the recent concerns, or one I've heard not so much of, but with the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest, that apparently is releasing viruses and bacteria into the population that had previously been pretty well contained. So there is a danger that there may be things coming from there that we just simply have not experienced before. And they may be bacterial or parasitic.
right, and I think a lot of when I think of ones caused by bacteria, it's more like the bubonic plague or something like that, and that has a lot to do with sanitation in some ways.
Yeah. And from when we talk about bacteria, they are susceptible to antibiotics. Of course, when you start talking about antibiotics, we get concerned about bacteria that become resistant, strands of the bacteria, and perhaps the overuse of antibiotics. That's also something that people are concerned about.
So, right, it's not that I think bacterial ones probably move slower than a little slower than viral, depending on.
I'm guessing, but I'm thinking that bacteria is probably not as airborne spread as viruses. I may be wrong on that, but that's something I would suspect to be true.
Yeah. So, okay, let's see. I still have the Bible of questions here. How do we foster a culture that values and prioritizes investments in pandemic preparedness and prevention in the same way that we do a strong, like, military defense? What should the United States do differently, both at home and abroad? I mean, because when you think of I think half of our budget goes to military spending.
I'm not sure the percentage, but very large percentages. Well, when you start thinking about, okay, what's our culture or what's our common focus on things, I think this past election has shown that people are really concerned about what affects them in their daily lives. Whether in this past election, whether it's been cost of food, cost of gas, or cost of whatever, and just inflation, what appears to be a major factor in what's happened. And you know, when you ask why aren't more people involved in these kinds of discussions that we're having today, they're busy living their lives. They're busy working, take care of their kids. They're busy working. They're busy, you know, doing other things. What you can say, why don't they prioritize this higher than going to the bar and have another beer after work? I don't know. You know, there may be a decline in social responsibility as well. You know, let's all take care of ourselves and don't worry. You know, like Coach Wallace said, mind your own damn business.
So yeah, it's a question of, it's like having been through COVID and all of the restrictions, you would think that people would be like, don't you want to be more prepared so that we don't have to go through something like that? But now it's that instead kind of that's the amnesia of like, let's put it behind us and not deal with it anymore. Yeah, I would think
we're tired of that stuff.
right. Don't talk to us about it because we're too tired to talk about it.
Yeah.
So, well, any more questions from anyone? Anyone? Just putting it out there. Okay. Yeah, I kind of feel like we've answered a lot of the ones that were in the book too. So it's not, I think we feel semi-pessimistic about the incoming government possibly not being able to deal with it. And here we go. We have some more questions. See, I knew if I started talking. So okay, I'm just going to talk about budget at the moment. Top 3 categories of the US budget currently: health insurance, 24%, Social Security, 21%, and defense, 13%. So,
and a large and growing percentage is interest on our national debt. And that's a real concern as well, with the growing deficit and growing national debt. So,
okay. Excellent question here. What about the morale of healthcare workers if there is a new pandemic, and even people leaving healthcare because of fatigue after this? So
obviously, that's a big concern. Our oldest son is a nurse, or has been in emergency rooms for over 10 years, and now he's at a different level. But you know, he reported, you know, just a lot of people were just getting darn tired. They were working long hours, feeling little support, putting themselves and their own families at risk. And the personal protection equipment that they needed to be wearing and stuff, just, you know, there was a big hassle in their jobs. You know, so, you know, that was a real concern. And obviously that discourages some people from joining the profession, which we already have a nursing shortage. And we are going to have an even greater shortage of nurses assistants, and just plain personal assistants for elderly, as a larger percentage of our population gets older. And you know, a good number of illegal immigrants do work in the elderly assistant field. And if we deport a large number of them or whatever, you that could be a major concern. So, every problem kind of spawns other problems. A lot of things are tied together.
Right. And I think they said that a lot of people are like going, oh, COVID is like a once in a century kind of thing. But I have a feeling that the experts feel like they're going to come sooner than we think versus
Yeah,
later.
we are so well connected today that something can jump from one setting to another really quickly. That is a major problem, and how quickly they can spread.
So, yeah, which is why it's a concern about health workers then, because will we be recovered enough to be able to face that with health workers who are not burnt out? So, okay, a quick update. Interest on US debt is 10% of our overall budget for the US currently, but could be rising as we go. Also, a kudos to you, Rick, from someone who, for the great presentation, also for your use of your lighting and background. They like that for a better focus on content. Well done. So, okay, any closing remarks, because we are nearing the end of our time.
Me, again, I would express my appreciation for people who are in the audience, because we need more people knowledgeable on these issues. We need to deal with facts, and obviously I've expressed some opinions, but I also shared a lot of facts that may be useful in your reaching your own opinions.
Yes, and it's definitely good. I mean, the statistics are out there to show people about vaccinations being effective. Thanks for sharing, whoever shared the dashboard for wastewater data. Great for us to be able to see that. And I also want to thank all of you for coming, participating, being willing to be that percent that does educate themselves. And hopefully you'll be able to have calm conversations with those who need to know about why we need to be more prepared for pandemics in the future. Thank you, Rick, for sharing your expertise, for being willing to come out on a early morning and talk with us. And this is the end of our sessions for the fall, and we will be starting up again the week of inauguration in January. So look for the library website and OLLI for upcoming being able to register for the winter terms. So thanks everyone. Have a great weekend, and we will see you all hopefully come January.
Have a great Thanksgiving and a Christmas season, or whatever you want to call this time of year.
Holiday season.
Holiday season. Yes.
So, okay, thanks everyone. Appreciate all of you.